I'm a plastic surgeon at Riverside Memorial Medical Complex in Portland, Oregon, or at least I was, until I submitted my resignation 4 weeks ago. You can call me Dr. Jonathan Whitmore if you want, though most people in the reconstructive surgery department just called me the tissue architect. During my 19 years there, I've performed over 3,000 reconstructive surgeries, house fire victims, industrial accident survivors, cancer patients requiring facial reconstruction, congenital deformities, motor vehicle trauma cases, and every conceivable type of facial and bodily trauma the human form can endure. But what I'm about to tell you about is the one case that made me question everything I thought I knew about human tissue regeneration, surgical healing, and the very foundations of reconstructive medicine, and ultimately led me to leave the profession that had defined my entire adult life. Riverside Memorial Medical Complex is the Pacific Northwest's premier reconstructive surgery center, serving patients from across Oregon, Washington, and Northern California. We're a level 1 trauma center with one of the most advanced microsurgery suites on the West Coast, specializing in cases that most hospitals consider impossible or too risky to attempt. During my tenure there, I served as the chief of facial reconstructive surgery, leading a team of 12 surgeons, residents, and specialized nurses. Our unit handled approximately 400 major reconstructive cases annually, ranging from routine skin cancer removals to complete facial transplants. We were the facility that other hospitals called when they encountered something they'd never seen before. The complexity of modern reconstructive surgery is difficult for people outside the medical field to comprehend. We're essentially biological engineers, rebuilding human anatomy from the cellular level up. A single major reconstruction might involve harvesting tissue from multiple donor sites on the patient's own body, microsurgically reconnecting blood vessels smaller than human hair, rebuilding bone structure with titanium frameworks, and carefully positioning muscle and skin to restore both function and appearance. Success rates for complex facial reconstruction vary dramatically based on the extent of the original trauma. For minor reconstructions involving single anatomical structures, we achieve excellent results in 85 to 90% of cases. For major reconstructions requiring multiple tissue types and structural rebuilding, success defined as restoration of basic function with acceptable cosmetic results drops to about 60 to 65%. For the most severe cases, those involving massive tissue loss or multiple failed previous surgeries, our success rate hovers around 30 to 40%. These statistics shaped how I approached each case and how I counseled patients and families about realistic expectations. After nearly 2 decades in reconstructive surgery, I thought I understood the absolute limits of what human tissue could achieve under the best possible surgical conditions. The case I'm about to describe began on August 15, 2021, at approximately 2:30 p.m. at the Cascade Chemical Processing Plant in Beaverton, Oregon. 28-year-old Isabella Moreau was working as a quality control supervisor in the facility's main production area when a catastrophic industrial accident occurred. A pressurized container holding experimental chemical solvent developed a microscopic crack in its titanium housing. Over the course of several hours, the crack slowly widened under the immense internal pressure until the container finally ruptured explosively. Isabella was conducting a routine inspection just 12 feet away when the explosion occurred. The blast itself threw Isabella approximately 20 feet across the production floor, but the explosion was only the beginning of her injuries. The experimental solvent, a highly corrosive compound designed to break down organic materials at the molecular level, splashed across the left side of her face and down her neck and shoulder before she could react. The chemical continued eating through her tissue for nearly 4 minutes before the plant's emergency response team could reach her and begin the neutralization process using specialized chemical wash solutions. By that time, the damage was unlike anything I had encountered in my entire career. When the paramedics first reached Isabella, approximately 70% of the left side of her face had been destroyed by the chemical burn. Her left eye was completely gone, along with the entire orbital socket and surrounding bone structure. The chemical had eaten through her cheek, exposing her teeth and the interior of her mouth. Her left ear was partially dissolved, and the burns extended down her neck, destroying her left carotid artery, several major muscle groups, and multiple layers of tissue down to her collarbone. Most critically, the chemical had damaged her airway. Isabella was conscious but unable to speak or breathe normally due to swelling and chemical burns in her throat and upper respiratory system. The paramedics had to perform an emergency tracheostomy on site just to keep her alive during transport. The trauma surgeon at Beaverton General Hospital, who first examined Isabella, later told me it was the most severe chemical burn injury he had witnessed in 30 years of emergency medicine. The combination of the explosive trauma and the ongoing tissue destruction from the chemical exposure created what he described as a perfect storm of surgical challenge. Isabella spent 8 weeks in the intensive care unit at Beaverton General, fighting for her life through multiple complications that threatened to kill her daily. The immediate medical priorities had nothing to do with reconstruction. The focus was entirely on preventing systemic organ failure, managing massive infections, and keeping her cardiovascular system stable. The chemical that had burned Isabella was so corrosive that it continued causing tissue death for days after the initial exposure. Even after the neutralization process, her body was essentially fighting a war against its own damaged cells. She underwent 14 emergency surgeries during those first 8 weeks, primarily to remove dead tissue, manage infections, and address life-threatening complications. Dr. Patricia Nakamura, Beaverton General's chief burn specialist, coordinated Isabella's care during this critical period. She later told me that Isabella's survival was miraculous in itself. Most patients with chemical burns covering that percentage of their body and involving that depth of tissue destruction don't survive the first 72 hours. Isabella's family, her parents, Robert and Marie Moreau, along with her younger sister Sophie, maintained a constant vigil at her bedside. Robert was a high school mathematics teacher, Marie worked as a librarian, and Sophie was completing her master's degree in environmental science. They were a close-knit, middle-class family from Salem, Oregon, with no previous experience navigating the medical system for anything more serious than routine illnesses. During those first 2 months, the family's focus was entirely on Isabella's survival. Reconstruction was a distant consideration. First, she had to live through each day. In early October 2021, when Isabella was finally medically stable enough to consider reconstructive options, Dr. Nakamura contacted our team at Riverside Memorial. She explained that Isabella's case was beyond the scope of what could be addressed at a general hospital and requested our assessment for possible reconstruction. I'll never forget my first examination of Isabella Moreau on October 12, 2021. Even after nearly 20 years of working with severe trauma cases, seeing the extent of her injuries was profoundly shocking. The left side of Isabella's face was simply gone. Not damaged, not disfigured, gone. Where her left eye, cheek, ear, and a significant portion of her jaw should have been, there was a carefully maintained open wound covered by specialized dressings. The chemical had eaten away tissue down to the bone in most areas, and in several places it had damaged the bone itself. Her remaining right eye was bright and alert, tracking my movements with obvious intelligence. Isabella could communicate by writing notes, as her tracheostomy prevented normal speech, but her cognitive function appeared completely unaffected by her injuries. After examining Isabella thoroughly and reviewing all of her medical records, x-rays, Connecticut scans, and surgical reports, I requested a consultation with my entire reconstructive team. We spent 3 hours reviewing her case, discussing options, and debating whether reconstruction was even feasible given the extent of the tissue loss. Creating a reconstructive plan for Isabella required us to essentially reimagine how to build a human face. The scope of the reconstruction was unlike anything we had attempted before, requiring techniques and approaches that pushed the absolute limits of current surgical capability. Working with my team, including Dr. Sarah Chen, microsurgery specialist, Dr. Marcus Williams, bone reconstruction, Dr. Elena Rodriguez, burn reconstruction, and Dr. James Park, ocular prosthetics, we developed what we called the Moreau Protocol, a comprehensive reconstruction plan that would require 12 separate major surgeries over approximately 3 years. Phase 1, Foundation Building, Surgeries 1, cranial bone grafts to rebuild orbital socket and cheek structure, titanium mesh framework, installation for facial support, carotid artery reconstruction using vascular grafts, neck and throat reconstruction to address airway and swallowing function. Phase 2, soft tissue reconstruction, surgeries 5 mice 8, latissimus dorsi muscle transplant from her back to restore facial muscle function, multiple skin grafts from her thigh and abdomen for facial coverage, ear reconstruction using rib cartilage and tissue expansion, neck skin grafting and scar tissue revision. Phase 3, refinement and function, surgeries 9 mice 12, prosthetic eye socket creation and fitting nose reconstruction and refinement, lip and mouth reconstruction for speech and eating function, final cosmetic adjustments and scar revision. I explained to Isabella and her family that this reconstruction would represent the absolute cutting edge of what was surgically possible. Our primary goals were functional, restoring her ability to eat, speak, breathe normally, and have some degree of facial expression. Cosmetic results would be secondary, and even with perfect execution of every surgery, Isabella would never look exactly as she had before the accident. The financial implications were staggering. The total cost of the reconstruction would exceed $800,000, not including the extensive rehabilitation, physical therapy, and psychological counseling that would be necessary. Fortunately, Isabella's employer's insurance policy included coverage for industrial accident reconstructions, and the state of Oregon had additional funds available for victims of workplace chemical accidents. Isabella's reaction to the surgical plan was remarkable. Despite the magnitude of what lay ahead, she approached the reconstruction with a combination of determination and realistic optimism that impressed everyone on our team. Using her notepad to communicate, Isabella wrote, "Dr. Whitmore, I understand this won't make me look normal. I just want to be able to teach again someday. If you can give me back my voice and the ability to eat without a feeding tube, I'll consider it a success." Isabella had been an elementary school teacher before the accident, working with third-grade students at Riverside Elementary in Salem. Teaching wasn't just her profession, it was her passion and her identity. The thought of returning to the classroom, even with significant facial differences, motivated her throughout the entire process. Her family's support was extraordinary. Robert took a leave of absence from his teaching position to coordinate Isabella's care. Marie organized the complex insurance paperwork and managed communication with the chemical plant's legal team. Sophie temporarily suspended her graduate studies to help with Isabella's daily care needs. The Moreau family approached the reconstruction with a combination of hope and scientific pragmatism. They asked detailed questions about each procedure, researched surgical techniques online, and connected with support groups for burn survivors and their families. They understood the limitations of what surgery could achieve while maintaining hope for the best possible outcome. We began Isabella's reconstruction on November 18, 2021, with the first bone grafting surgery. The procedure involved harvesting pieces of her hip bone and ribs to rebuild the left orbital socket and cheekbone structure that had been destroyed by the chemical burn. The surgery lasted 14 hours. My team and I worked meticulously to position each piece of bone graft with precision, securing them with titanium screws and allowing space for the soft tissue reconstruction that would come later. The procedure went flawlessly from a technical standpoint. Every graft was positioned correctly, blood supply was maintained, and there were no complications. Isabella's recovery from the first surgery exceeded our expectations. Bone grafts typically take 8–12 weeks to fully integrate, but Isabella's healing was remarkably rapid. Within 6 weeks, follow-up X-rays showed excellent bone integration and no signs of rejection or complications. We proceeded with the second surgery in early January 2022, installation of the titanium mesh framework that would support the eventual soft tissue reconstruction. Again, the surgery was technically perfect, and Isabella's healing was faster than typical. By March 2022, we had completed the first 4 surgeries of the Morrow protocol. Each procedure had been successful, and Isabella's recovery time between surgeries was consistently shorter than we had projected. Her attitude remained positive throughout, and she had begun working with a speech therapist to prepare for the eventual removal of her tracheostomy. As we moved into phase 2 of Isabella's reconstruction in April 2022, I began noticing small details that seemed unusual, though at the time I attributed them to Isabella's young age, excellent physical condition, and positive attitude. The integration between her bone grafts and existing bone structure was more complete than I typically saw. The titanium mesh framework showed none of the minor inflammatory responses that usually occur as the body adjusts to foreign materials. Most notably, the skin around her surgical sites was healing with minimal scarring, unusual for someone who had undergone such extensive trauma and multiple major surgeries. Dr. Chen, my microsurgery specialist, mentioned during one of our team meetings that Isabella's blood vessel regrowth was textbook perfect. Dr. Williams noted that her bone density at the graft sites was actually higher than normal. These were positive developments, but they were also somewhat unexpected. Isabella's family was thrilled with her progress. "She's healing so well," Marie told me during one of our consultations. "Sometimes I look at the surgical sites and I'm amazed at how good they look. It's like her body was designed for this kind of healing." In June 2022, we performed Isabella's 5th surgery, the latissimus dorsi muscle transplant that would eventually allow her to have some degree of facial expression on the reconstructed side. This was one of the most complex procedures in the entire protocol, requiring microsurgical connection of blood vessels and nerve pathways to ensure the transplanted muscle would function properly. The surgery itself went perfectly, but during the procedure, I noticed something that puzzled me. Isabella's tissue response to surgical trauma was different from what I had seen in other patients. Her blood vessels seemed to adapt to surgical manipulation more readily, and her tissue maintained better color and perfusion throughout the lengthy procedure. More significantly, when we examined the muscle tissue under magnification during the transplant, the cellular structure appeared remarkably healthy and robust, better than what I typically saw in tissue that had been subjected to such extensive previous trauma and multiple surgeries. I mentioned these observations to my team, but without any negative implications. We documented them as positive healing factors and continued with the reconstruction plan. By August 2022, Isabella had undergone 7 of her 12 planned surgeries. Her progress was so remarkable that we had been able to accelerate the timeline for several procedures. Most significantly, we had been able to remove her tracheostomy earlier than expected, restoring her ability to speak. The first time I heard Isabella's voice, after nearly a year of communication through written notes, was an emotional moment for everyone involved. Her speech was slightly different due to the reconstruction of her throat and mouth structures, but it was clear, strong, and completely intelligible. "Dr. Whitmore," she said, her voice carrying a slight raspiness that somehow made it more compelling. "I can't thank you enough. I feel like myself again. But even as Isabella's reconstruction progressed beyond our most optimistic expectations, I was beginning to notice things that didn't align with everything I knew about surgical healing and tissue recovery. Throughout Isabella's reconstruction, we maintained detailed photographic documentation of her progress, standard practice for complex cases, and essential for insurance purposes and medical record keeping. When I reviewed these photographs in sequence in September 2022, I noticed patterns that seemed to suggest something beyond normal healing. The progression of Isabella's healing wasn't just faster than typical, it was following patterns I had never seen before. Surgical scars that should have remained visible for years were fading to barely perceptible lines. The color matching between transplanted and original tissue was becoming so seamless that it was difficult to identify the boundaries between different tissue sources. Most remarkably, some of the reconstructed areas appeared to be developing better functional capacity than I had predicted, based on the extent of nerve and muscle damage from her original injuries. The Moreau family had been documenting Isabella's recovery with their own photographs and videos, sharing updates with extended family and friends who had been following her journey. In September 2022, Sophie showed me a time-lapse video she had created using photos taken throughout Isabella's reconstruction. Watching that video was the first time I truly understood that something unprecedented was happening with Isabella's case. The video showed Isabella's face healing in ways that seemed to accelerate beyond normal biological processes. But more than the speed of healing, it was the quality and completeness of the reconstruction that defied my understanding of surgical possibilities. Dr. Whitmore, Sophie said as we watched the video together, I know this might sound strange, but sometimes it seems like Isabella's face is healing itself, like the surgery is just giving her body permission to fix what was damaged, and then her tissue does things that go beyond what the surgery actually did. I wanted to dismiss Sophie's observation as the hopeful interpretation of a loving sister, but as I watched that time-lapse video, I couldn't shake the feeling that she was describing something I had been noticing but hadn't been willing to acknowledge. As we prepared for Isabella's 8th surgery in October 2022, I ordered comprehensive imaging studies and tissue analysis, more extensive than typically required for routine surgical planning. I told my team it was to ensure we were optimizing every aspect of the remaining procedures, but truthfully, I was trying to understand what was happening with Isabella's healing that seemed to go beyond normal biological processes. The results of those studies would challenge everything I thought I understood about reconstructive surgery, tissue regeneration, and the fundamental limits of human healing. But that discovery, and how it would change my entire understanding of medicine and ultimately end my career, is a story I'll have to continue next time. When the comprehensive imaging studies and tissue analysis results came back on October 15, 2022, I stared at them in my office for over 2 hours, convinced there had been a catastrophic error in patient identification, sample handling, or equipment calibration. What I was looking at was medically impossible. Isabella's tissue samples showed cellular regeneration patterns that defied every principle of reconstructive surgery I had learned in 20 years of practice. The bone grafts hadn't just integrated with her existing bone structure, they had somehow triggered new bone growth that was denser and stronger than her original bone tissue. The transplanted muscle showed nerve reconnection that was more complete than what we had surgically created. Most impossibly, her skin tissue was displaying characteristics that suggested active cellular regeneration at a rate and quality that human skin simply cannot achieve. Under microscopic analysis, Isabella's reconstructed tissue looked healthier and more robust than normal, undamaged tissue from a person her age. Dr. Sarah Chen, my microsurgery specialist, was the first person I called to review the results. Jonathan, she said, after examining the tissue analysis, Either our lab has made the most significant error in medical history, or we're looking at something that's going to rewrite textbooks. I immediately ordered duplicate tests from an independent laboratory using tissue samples we had preserved from Isabella's previous surgeries. 3 days later, those results came back identical to the first set. As we prepared for Isabella's 8th surgery, what was supposed to be a routine skin grafting procedure, I noticed that some of the surgical sites we had planned to address appeared to have improved significantly since her last examination just 2 weeks earlier. The scarring from her previous surgeries had faded to barely visible lines. The color matching between transplanted skin and her original tissue was so seamless that even I, who had performed every surgery, had difficulty identifying the boundaries between different tissue sources. Most remarkably, Isabella was reporting sensation and muscle control in reconstructed areas that shouldn't have been possible given the extent of nerve damage from her original chemical burns. On the morning of October 28, 2022, as Isabella was being prepped for surgery, I made a decision that would fundamentally change the course of her treatment and my career. Instead of proceeding with the planned skin grafting, I performed the most comprehensive photographic and video documentation of a patient I had ever conducted. What those images revealed was beyond anything I had encountered in medical literature. Isabella's face, which had been 70% destroyed by chemical burns just 14 months earlier, looked nearly normal. Not good for a reconstruction patient. Normal. The left side of her face, which we had rebuilt entirely using bone grafts, muscle transplants, and skin grafts, was virtually indistinguishable from her undamaged right side. Her prosthetic eye socket had developed so naturally that the artificial eye moved and tracked almost like a real eye. Her reconstructed ear had shape, color, and texture that matched her original ear perfectly. The skin grafts had not just taken, they had somehow integrated and refined themselves to match the exact tone, texture, and elasticity of her original facial skin. I immediately called in every specialist I could reach. Over the following week, Isabella was examined by reconstructive surgeons, dermatologists, tissue specialists, and cellular biologists from 3 major medical centers. Each expert reached the same conclusion I had. What we were observing was scientifically impossible. Dr. Michael Harrison, a tissue regeneration researcher from Johns Hopkins, spent 2 days studying Isabella's case. Dr. Whitmore, he told me, I've spent 15 years studying cellular regeneration and wound healing. What I'm seeing in this patient represents healing capabilities that are decades beyond our current understanding of human biology. Lisa Wang, a cellular biologist from Stanford, was even more direct. This patient's tissue is regenerating at the cellular level in ways that human tissue simply cannot do. If I didn't see the before and after documentation myself, I would say this level of healing is biologically impossible. The most unsettling aspect of Isabella's impossible recovery was that she seemed completely unaware that anything unusual was happening. When I gently asked her about her remarkable healing, Isabella responded with genuine confusion. Dr. Whitmore, isn't this how reconstruction is supposed to work? I mean, you're an amazing surgeon. I just figured this was what happens when you have the best medical team. Isabella's family was equally mystified by the medical community's amazement at her recovery. She looks wonderful, her mother Marie told me, but we always believed she would. We had faith in your abilities and Isabella's strength. It was as if Isabella and her family were living in a reality where impossible healing was simply the expected outcome of good medical care and positive thinking. By December 2022, Isabella's healing had accelerated beyond even the impossible pace we had already documented. Surgical procedures that we had planned for the following year were becoming unnecessary as her tissue continued to regenerate and refine itself. Her speech, which had been good after throat reconstruction, became completely normal. Her facial expressions, limited initially by muscle transplant limitations, became naturally fluid and completely symmetrical. Most impossibly, she began reporting sensation in areas where we knew the original nerve damage had been irreversible. On December 15, 2022, I performed what I thought would be Isabella's ninth surgery, a minor scar revision procedure. When I made the initial incision, her tissue responded to the surgical trauma in ways I had never seen before. The bleeding was minimal, almost immediately controlled by natural clotting that happened faster than normal physiology allows. The tissue edges aligned themselves almost perfectly without manual positioning. Most remarkably, when I examined the incision site just 48 hours later, it had healed with no visible scarring and complete restoration of normal tissue function. I was no longer performing reconstructive surgery on Isabella Moreau. I was witnessing biological regeneration that defied medical science. The final turning point in my ability to continue practicing medicine came on January 8, 2023, during what was supposed to be Isabella's final surgical consultation. Isabella arrived at my office, looking completely normal. Not good for a burn reconstruction patient, completely perfectly normal. If I hadn't performed every surgery myself, if I hadn't seen the before and after documentation, I would never have believed she had been injured at all. Dr. Whitmore, Isabella said, her voice clear and strong. I can't thank you enough for everything you've done. I'm ready to go back to teaching. I feel like myself again. Actually, I feel better than I ever have. Looking at Isabella, I realized that her healing had surpassed not just the limitations of reconstructive surgery, but the normal parameters of human biology. Her skin had a quality and vitality that seemed enhanced beyond normal human tissue. Her facial structure was not just restored, it appeared to be optimized. That afternoon, I stared at Isabella's complete medical file, 400 pages, documenting the most extensive chemical burn reconstruction in medical history, concluding with a patient whose healing had transcended every known biological limitation. I could not explain what had happened to Isabella Moreau. More troubling, I could not guarantee that what I had witnessed could be replicated, predicted, or understood within the framework of current medical science. How do you continue practicing reconstructive surgery when you have witnessed healing that defies the fundamental principles of your profession? Over the following months, I found myself unable to provide families with realistic expectations for their loved ones' reconstructions. How could I tell them that surgery had limitations when I had seen those limitations completely transcended? I began second-guessing every surgical decision, wondering if other patients had healing capabilities that I was failing to recognize or support. I spent excessive time with each patient, looking for signs of the extraordinary regeneration I had witnessed in Isabella's case. 6 months after Isabella's final consultation, I was consulting on a similar case, a young man who had suffered severe burns in a house fire. As I explained to his family the realistic limitations of what reconstruction could achieve, I noticed what appeared to be unusually good healing at his graft sites. His family insisted that he seemed to be recovering faster than expected, that his skin grafts were integrating better than the other doctors had predicted. I found myself wondering, was I witnessing the beginning of another impossible healing, or was Isabella's case making me see extraordinary recovery where there was only normal, expected healing? I completed that consultation, but I knew I could no longer practice reconstructive surgery with the scientific confidence that patients and families deserved. 3 weeks later, I submitted my resignation from Riverside Memorial Medical Complex. In my resignation letter, I wrote that I was leaving to pursue research opportunities, but the truth was that Isabella Moreau's case had fundamentally shaken my confidence in everything I thought I understood about human biology, surgical healing, and the nature of medical possibility. How could I continue to practice medicine when I had witnessed something that challenged the basic scientific framework of my profession? Isabella returned to teaching in September 2023. She's back in her 3rd grade classroom at Riverside Elementary, working with the same age group she taught before her accident. Her students and colleagues are unaware that she ever underwent reconstruction surgery. When I last spoke with Isabella in March 2024, she mentioned that several people had commented on how healthy and vibrant she looked, asking if she had been using new skincare products or if she had been working out. Isabella laughed about these comments, attributing her appearance to good genes and a positive attitude. She has no awareness that her healing represented something unprecedented in medical science. To Isabella, her recovery was simply the natural result of good medical care, family support, and personal determination. Isabella's case has been documented in 3 medical journals, though the papers focus primarily on surgical techniques rather than the impossible aspects of her healing. Most of the medical community that reviewed her case attributed her exceptional results to optimal surgical conditions, excellent patient health, and statistical anomaly. But I know what I witnessed goes beyond statistical anomaly or optimal conditions. Isabella's healing represented something that current medical science cannot explain or predict. I now work as a general practice physician in a small clinic in Bend, Oregon, focusing on routine medical care, diabetes management, hypertension, preventive care, and conditions with established diagnostic criteria and predictable treatment outcomes. I deliberately avoid any cases involving trauma, reconstruction, or complex healing scenarios. But I never stopped thinking about Isabella Moreau and what her case might mean for our understanding of human biological capability. Following medical literature on tissue regeneration, cellular biology, and healing research, I've been encouraged by advances in stem cell therapy and regenerative medicine that seem to be approaching some of the healing capabilities I witnessed in Isabella's case. Perhaps what I saw was not impossible, but simply decades ahead of current medical understanding. Maybe Isabella's tissue had some genetic or biological characteristic that allowed her to access healing capabilities that exist in human biology but remain largely dormant or undiscovered. Isabella's case raises profound questions about the limits of human healing and the potential capabilities of the human body that we haven't yet learned to access or understand. If Isabella's level of regenerative healing exists within human biological possibility, what other healing capabilities might be available that current medicine doesn't recognize or support? Her case suggests that the boundaries between possible and impossible in human healing may be far more fluid than we currently understand. The case of Isabella Moreau will always remain the most transformative and unexplainable experience of my medical career. It taught me that medicine, for all its advances and sophistication, still contains profound mysteries that challenge our most fundamental assumptions about human biology and healing. Isabella's impossible recovery gave her back not just her face, but a life that surpassed even her pre-accident baseline. It allowed her to return to the classroom she loved, to work with children who see her as their normal, healthy teacher, completely unaware of the medical miracle they interact with every day. For the medical community, Isabella's case serves as a reminder that human healing capabilities may extend far beyond our current understanding, and that the human body may contain regenerative potential that we're only beginning to discover. The case of Isabella Moreau changed my life by showing me that the impossible can become reality through mechanisms we don't yet comprehend. It humbled me as a physician and as a human being, reminding me that there are aspects of human biology and healing that remain mysterious, wonderful, and completely beyond our current ability to explain. Sometimes the most important lesson medicine can teach us is how much we still don't know about the incredible capabilities of the human body and the nature of healing itself.